I probably read your name first in 1976 when you published that article in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics on how supply impacted on consumption and what role for research. I think that was really a breakthrough. And those of you of the next generation who haven't read that paper, I think you should take another look at it. It was completely new thinking, and it circulated in Göttingen when we were where I was a doctoral student at that time. David, thank you for calling us together. And mind you, I come from a Festschrift country, as you hear from my accent. Festschrifts notoriously are critiqued for being too selective, actually not selective enough, selective by friends, too heterogeneous, and typically show a lot of recycled material. I think recycling is actually not bad, which brings me to my topic of today. Per, we haven't been much in touch the last 3 years, I'm afraid, which I'm sorry about, and you remarked that in a recent phone conversation. And it was much more intensive when I still was in Washington. It's, I think, tomorrow 4 years ago that I left this wonderful country and moved back to Germany. And one of the things which I got pulled in, besides leading a research institute, is the topic I'm talking about, bioeconomy. I've become chair of the German government's Bioeconomy Council that advises 6 ministries on a 6-year budget of about $3 billion of research money on bioeconomy. And later in my talk, I will argue what all this means for science policy, because I think this will not go away. It will fundamentally change the environment in which we are doing research on agriculture, food, and nutrition. I think we are in a process of redefining agriculture and the food system, from traditional agriculture towards a value chain and ecosystems perspective, all the way to linked value chains, value webs, the bioeconomy. That's what I'm talking about. The traditional perspective of agriculture research was very commodity focused. Ruben, you remember how the CGIAR was wrestling with not too commodity focused to be. And out of this came more value chain and systems perspective. But there are now big competing goals superimposed on everything what grows, the agriculture, forestry, etc. sector. There's the goal of low ecological footprints, sustainable production, zero carbon emissions, zero waste. And these are certainly competing goals. And they are not just competing goals in rich countries. We define bioeconomy as the production and use of biological resources to provide products, processes, services in all economic sectors within the frame of a sustainable economic system. So bioeconomy is not simply an extension, as I will explain, of agriculture. The interlinked value chains forming a bioeconomic value web is what's currently in the making. Yes, there are foods and feeds and the bioenergy sector. Probably most of you think about bioenergy first when you hear bioeconomy. That's one aspect of it, partly an aberration, I believe. Then biomass-based new raw materials, but also the interlinkages with financial markets in relation to how biomass is currently being traded and will be traded in the future. And these are not just columns, but they are interlinked. That's why I prefer to talk about value webs. Our profession is challenged by the economics of value webs. It's far more complicated than research on commodities or on value chains. The transactions cost story in webs are extremely complex. The opportunity costs of natural resources cut across the whole system. Capturing externalities is becoming more complex when they cut across value chains. Whole web efficiency, we don't have solid modeling tools for that, and let alone studying the distributional effects across webs. The bioeconomy is not really a sector. It's a cluster of elements of sectors. And it's a list which is pretty long, as I have put it here on this slide. Agriculture and the food industry are, of course, key elements in it, but parts of pharmaceutical sector, pulp and paper industry, etc., are certainly part of it. I've plugged in a few photos. These are photos from newly built biorefineries which are coming up. For instance, bottom right, it's a large-scale biorefinery in the middle of Germany. The modern chemical industry, top left and bottom left, are all currently investing hundreds of millions in new biomass to chemical bio-based processing facilities, especially focused on succinic acids as a new raw material, both for the food industry and for the bioplastics industry. With a heavy dose of white biotechnology, new fermentation approaches, and that changes the landscape. That whole technology changes the landscape of what we used to call the agricultural raw material industry. It has also far-reaching implications for food components and for packaging. Here are, for your entertainment, a few new bioeconomy products, from bioplastics to bio-based car materials at the bottom right, building materials here on this stuff here, wood pellet based and so on. So the idea of bioeconomy, you use bio-based material before you burn them. So bioenergy is largely an aberration. Bioenergy up front is largely an aberration. In the middle, there's bio-based synthetic spider fibers, which will in the future, or actually they have started to pull elevators up in town in 100-story buildings, so which steel cables couldn't do. So it's what I'm communicating to you is this is infiltrating the whole economy. It's not a substitution effect which is only happening here, such as biofuel versus petrol from Saudi Arabia, but it is new products, new processes, and if they are more efficient, they win, otherwise not. You want to read more about applications, it's on this slide. I think it's on the website. Let me come, or on the site of this conference, let me come to what is driving all that, and a bit more theory of bioeconomy. There are three megatrends which really drive us into bioeconomy, and I don't think just that is not just a Central Europe tendency. Developing countries are also moving partly into this direction. One, it is changing prices and price expectations which drive this trend. Secondly, it's changing consumer preferences. And third is innovation in technology. The three are coming together. They're pretty fundamental. And prices and price expectations is sort of theoretically driven by good old Hayami Ruten, factor price change expectations. Changing preferences is a lot more complicated, where this comes from. I think it may have to do with some of the demographic changes, which we just heard from Barbara. The world is aging. Less risk preferences go down. And demand for insurance changes. The idea that this planet exists for about probably 2 billion more years, rather than just thinking about this generation and the next, is sinking in. And so how to come to sustainable lifestyles and sustainable industries. Taking a more short-term perspective, rather than getting carried away with very long-term ones, a bioeconomy changes the supply and demand balance of the world food equation through forces which are on the left-hand side with productivity and technology, the response to climate change, on the right-hand side on biomass uses, and in trade and markets. The global distribution of biomass is changing. It should be a strong absolute advantage of low-income countries, where it's green. The global distribution of biomass has been increasing. It's an article from Science in 2010. Where it's reddish, it's decreasing. Climate change seems to work against biomass absolute advantage of low-income countries. So we need to watch that. The value of biomass, the value distribution, will of course define a comparative advantage in the long run. Currently, market price and market volume relationships are in the bioeconomy portrayed roughly by this pyramid, that market prices are, of course, highest in the top of the pyramid with biomaterials and biochemicals, but market volume is, of course, in the other direction. Which prices really drive food prices in a bioeconomy? Food prices are no longer defined by food supply and demand in a bioeconomy. They are driven by a whole set of other prices as the food system is becoming part of the bioeconomy context. And so there are endless numbers of substitution effects which drive competing prices through the biomass interlinkages. And they impact then on the shadow prices of water and land and energy. Let me just touch on one aspect which may concern us. If the bioeconomy lowers the level of the world food equation, it may come into a more volatile situation, so volatility may increase. And that then gives rise to speculative effects, and where oil price spikes translate more rapidly into food price spikes. The regression exercise simply listed here from a recent article which we had in Food Policy underlines these relationships. So a risky part of bioeconomy is to introduce more risks in the food sector, in the food markets. So some future research questions around the bioeconomy in relation to food security are these three, in my opinion. So the new economy-wide competitions for biomass, are there adverse impacts on food security? We need to look into that. It can be positive or negative. This can be a job machine in low-income countries, a high-return sector in countries, especially in parts of Africa, with a high resource base for bioeconomy, but it can also be adverse on the poor. So what are complementarities in value chains? How can we enhance economic efficiency and environmental sustainability in a bioeconomy context? And to what extent can the science and technology investments counter the potential adverse effects of bioeconomy, increased demand for biomass for non-food purposes? To what extent can R&D investments counter these effects? One more point regarding volatility, biomass scarcity, and nutrition. In a recent exercise in my institute, we find from a cross-country panel data set on nutrition indicators that increased volatility has a serious adverse effect on child underweight. Well, it's hypothetical that biomass is constraining availability of foods. This is the simplistic approach going through the first of the four factors which define food security. But it gives us pause, and we should dig deeper into these relationships that more risks with which the poor cannot cope because of lack of resilience may translate into adverse nutrition effects. Then we come to some conclusions, what all this means for resetting the research agenda for agriculture. On this slide, I have listed the countries which in the last 5 years have all written themselves bioeconomy strategies, underwritten by hundreds of millions or billions, to get into this sector of promise. And I actually do believe it's a very promising sector. Once we move beyond a simplistic bioenergy focus of biomass utilization. And once we found ways to protect consumption and nutrition of the poor in this development. The US actually has moved rather late into this with the White House paper, National Bioeconomy Blueprint, and doesn't seem to be that much driven by it. France has moved into it very powerfully this year with revamping its, so they are not yet on the map, revamping their system. And a number of Africa is currently having its bioeconomy strategy in front of its cabinet. So it's sort of a global science policy trend, which I think we agricultural economists or food security scholars need to watch and need to help guide. Because innovation through science and technology impacts all aspects of availability, access, and utilization of food and nutrition security. And STI, science, technology, innovation, impacts not only on products, but resource utilization and on processing. And a key aspect of bioeconomy, as I said, is cascading and recycling issues. What innovations can contribute to world food security? We know from Keith Fugle's wonderful work on where total factor productivity comes from. Yeah, this is all, the world is currently nourishing itself from innovation, and no longer from area expansion, irrigation, and inputs. That part here will be much tougher to maintain because innovation will not just work for food and nutrition security, but will work for the whole system innovations. And there are competing claims for biomass. The ingredients of science policy for innovation in bioeconomy require a new structured approach for innovation that is a complex set of priorities. This is what we have worked out in the German Bioeconomy Council in 3 strategic areas of technological progress, food security, and resource management. For our profession, I think there are 4 implications. Noting the limitations of isolated value chain, agriculture sector, and commodity analyses, learning about a much broader set of relevant technologies. It's difficult enough to learn technologies of food production and processing and distribution. This is, I'm afraid, scholars really need to learn a lot more about the whole biorefinery industry and what's happening currently in wood pellets and co-firing of energy plants, and how the CO2 market will change the whole competitiveness of food and agriculture in a bioeconomy context. I underline that distributional effects related to the whole agro-biomass system with many externalities is a challenge for us. If we are concerned about poverty, we need to get into that. I think we probably need to include a lot more research on industrial organization into agricultural economics, so industry competitiveness, regulation, etc., in order to optimize the system in a bioeconomy context. And let me close with this call that because bioeconomy is complex and policies can go easily wrong, I think we need a new institutional setup globally, mapped after the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, but avoiding its pitfalls from the beginning, a global body tasked with mapping out the challenges for agricultural development, food and nutrition security in a bioeconomy context. This to address our challenges in the context of food and agriculture, not knowing the rest of it, not having the skills and knowledge at the table, will be a doomed strategy. So an international agriculture research system that calls itself agriculture research system without taking note of the bioeconomy challenges and opportunities, I think, Per, will be yesterday's system pretty soon. And I know you are still in the middle of policy guidance and advice in this field. So I think it's an important task you have ahead of yourself. So don't go for the Black Forest cake yet. This is your challenge. Thank you for your attention.